We are elated to welcome you to this final session. It has been 1 month that we have been meeting here every Tuesday to discuss on undoing and doing queerness in the European South through the examples of Italy and Greece. In this seminar series for the ILCS's Center for the Study of Contemporary Women's Writing, we have been venturing to explore queerness and its affordances for counter-hegemonic critique and resistance within the cultural framework of two countries of the European South, Italy and Greece. For us, the intersection of queerness and the European South opens up possibilities to seize and reconfigure key concepts of these homonationalist, capitalist, and patriarchal political agendas, namely family, transition, antiquity, and crisis. Instead of a hotbed of intense biopolitical and necropolitical management, we envision the queer European South as a positionality for world-making critique and solidary community building. So, in this seminar series, we have welcomed over the course of 4 weeks, I think 9 speakers and more than 80 participants. Thank you all for being so faithful and punctual to our rendezvous. So this seminar series is the product of long spells of intellectual and affective sharing and bonding with Alice. When it comes to the rationale behind today's panel, thinking and feeling together triggered a realization that we inhabit a common space of experiences in which the epistemologies fashioning the European South, the representations, discourses, and modalities of governmentality imposed, were constantly reenacting and heavily instrumentalizing the concept of crisis, be it migrant, financial, sociocultural, linguistic, or political. So we started asking each other and ourselves, how is the performativity of language conducive to creating subjects in crisis, but also subjects critically thinking? What alternative forms of agency and grammars of resistance can be revealed? How do feminist and queer instances of marginalized writing and art critical accounts reckon with, renegotiate, and transform crisisscapes into platforms for coalition? In our effort to probe the analytical potential of these queries, we are grateful to Maria and Vera, who responded so kindly to our invitation and are today here with us, along with their pets. The insights of Maria and Vera have been seminal and inspirational, especially when it comes to the power of language, to how we do things with words, even when such ventures go awry, and the potentialities this linguistic feature upholds to critical thinking, alternative modes of agencies, and the unpacking of. So, without further ado, let us give a warm welcome to Maria and Vera. We will be hearing first from Maria, whose title is Grammar and Disinfrastructure, Revisiting the Politics of the Middle Voice in Post-Crisis Greece. Maria Boletsi is endowed professor of modern Greek studies at the University of Amsterdam, Marilena Laskaridis Chair, and associate professor in film and comparative literature at Leiden University. She is the author of Barbarism and Its Discontents and Spectres of Cavalfi, and co-author of Barbarian Explorations of the Western Conceptive Theory, Literature, and the Arts. He has recently co-edited the volumes Untimely Crisis, Chronodopes and Critique, Languages of Resistance, Transformation and Futurity in Mediterranean Crisisscapes, and as well as the special issues, Greek and the South for the Journal of Greek Media and Culture, and Ruins in Contemporary Greek Literature, Art, Cinema, and Public Space for the Journal of Modern Greek Studies. Her latest project focuses on the concept of the weird and its mobilizations in contemporary literature, art, ecology, and politics. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Billy, for this wonderful introduction, and both to you, Alice and Billy, for this invitation and this wonderful seminar series that you have put together. I'm really excited to be part of it. And as you could see from my book titles, I have a thing for long titles. I'm sorry about that. And my title, the title of my talk today is also quite longish. I will share it. I will share my screen. Can you see it? Okay, good. Let me put it on full screen. So my talk today, and let me just say that it will be a kind of a longish one, about 30 minutes, I think. It's about grammar, and specifically about how the grammar of the middle voice provides a conceptual infrastructure that might give us ways to navigate chronic crisis and broken social and material infrastructures in Greece and beyond. And what I will share comes from part of a project on grammars of crisis and the middle voice that I've been working on and off for I think since 2014, among other things, and which I've tried recently to update with new insights. And some of you might actually wonder what the hell is the middle voice. You're not the only ones. This happens a lot, so I will explain that. But let me first frame the topic a little bit before I do that. So in this project, I propose grammatical categories as figures of thought or as conceptual infrastructures that can at times reproduce normative conditions of life, but can also generate queer, utopian, alternative imaginaries and modes of sociality. And in my previous work, I looked at the political affordances of the middle voice through its mobilizations in a series of wall writings and other, let's say, public artworks, activist work in Greece during the so-called crisis decade between 2009 and 2018, but also in protest cultures elsewhere in the European South, such as in Istanbul or in Spain. And these are, what you see now on the screen are cases of what I developed as a visual middle voice or a multimedial middle voice, but I will not go into them, into these cases today. Now, this project on crisis and languages of resistance took shape in the midst of a crisis in Greece that was unfolding at the time that I was trying to write about the, let's say, contrarian grammars that emerged from it. And today I will try to revisit some of these wall writings that I wrote about back then from a different vantage point. So 6 years after the declared end of the crisis, when Greece exited the international bailout program in 2018. And although conditions of precarity, structural problems with the Greek economy and other things would immediately contradict any claim that Greece has actually exited the crisis, what did shift after 2018 is the dominant political narrative in Greece, which moved from crisis as this all-encompassing framework, which is kind of captured in the motto "Crisis, what else?" here, and this obsession with blame, the blame game during the crisis, towards notions of rebuilding, recovery, and happiness. And some of you might recognize this image here as the opening shot of Marina Sati's music video for her song Zari, with which she participated in the Eurovision a couple of weeks ago. And this motto, Greece is bliss, perfectly captures this or frames the very kitsch kind of tourist narrative of Greece that this music video projects, with an ironic wink, I would say, as the whole video is this huge parodic excess of tourist cliches associated with Athens and Greece from the past decades. Now, this neoliberal narrative of happiness is part of a rebranding of Greece for domestic and international consumption, for the tourist industry also, that the ruling party in Greece since 2019 has been propagating. And Dimitris Soudias and Philip Katsinas have written about this, and I will refer to their work later on. Now, here is for an example, to give an example, here is Konstantinos Mitsotakis, the Greek PM, in a speech from the summer of 2020, very appropriately framed against the famous Santorini sunset, announcing a state of happiness as a hook for the tourist reopening of the country after the first wave of the pandemic. And this is part of his speech where he says, "We are, it seems, getting used to a new normal. It has not, however, and will not change us forever, because the Greek summer, as many of you know, is much more than the shimmering sea and the stunning sunset. It is a state of mind, as our current campaign states, our recent campaign, sorry. A feeling of happiness, of freedom, of tranquility, and nothing can take that ever away. And these feelings, these emotions are probably even more necessary today for us to experience as we are coming out of the first wave of the pandemic. This is why I'm so proud to be standing here tonight, knowing that Greece is very much open for business. Now, in the same speech, Mitsotakis also refers to Greece's strong infrastructures that will allow the country to tackle a possible new wave of the pandemic. Now, in post-crisis Greece, however, many infrastructures are still very much broken, quite literally so. If we just think of that train accident last year in Tempe, which was the deadliest rail disaster in Greek history and claimed 57 lives. So this post-crisis happiness narrative cruelly stumbles against this precarious and quite polarized public sphere in Greece, in which people try to survive, build lives, forge relations within conditions of what Lauren Berlant has called crisis ordinariness. And this is a struggle even more challenging for those facing social marginalization, racial violence, homophobia, gender violence, of which, unfortunately, there have been too many examples in recent years in Greece. Think just about the femicides that are definitely on the rise in the country. Now, living in the present, Lauren Berlant wrote in Cruel Optimism, is an experience of living in and through continuous crisis and traumatic events that, quote, force people to adapt to an unfolding change and to embed crisis in the ordinary, end quote. This condition of crisis ordinariness, he calls it, involves this disjunction between the fantasy of an, let's say, ordinary or good life and the actual precariousness of the public sphere that makes the realization of this fantasy, for most people at least, untenable. When faced with a broken infrastructure, Berlant argues in another article that she wrote in 2016, so when the Eurozone crisis was still in full swing. So when faced with a broken infrastructure, we shouldn't only think in terms of repair or replacement of this infrastructure, but we should also think, she says, how we can generate, quote, a form from within brokenness, beyond the exigencies of the current crisis, and alternatively to it too. So even failure opens up the potential, I quote again from Berlant, for new organizations of life. And this doesn't need to be conflated with a repair of what is not working. So here is a somewhat longer quote, but it's quite important that I read it because it kind of frames what I think I'm trying to say. So the glitch of the present that we link to economic crisis, for example, threads through other ongoing emergencies involving the movement of bodies into and out of citizenship and other forms of being with, occupation, and jurisdiction. So contemporary anti-austerity politics point not only to new ties among disparately located and unequally precarious lives, but also mark the need for a collective struggle to determine the terms of transition for general social existence. Terms of transition provide conceptual infrastructures. So this is where I'm getting my conceptual infrastructures idea in the title, not only as ideas, but also as part of the protocols or practices that hold the world up. So this is actually her understanding of infrastructures and those practices that hold the world up. To attend to the terms of transition is to forge an imaginary for managing the meanwhile within damaged life's perdurance, a meanwhile that allows for ambivalence, destruction, antagonism, and inattention not to destroy collective existence. So which conceptual infrastructures could help people build lives in conditions of crisis and within broken infrastructures? And how can the middle voice then intervene in neoliberal narratives of happiness or rebuilding, regrowth, etc., that governmental rhetoric has been promoting since 2018? And how can a thinking through of grammatical categories as conceptual infrastructures give us perhaps alternative modes, forms of agency that might empower dispossessed subjects who live in broken infrastructure? I won't answer all these questions today, but I'm throwing them out as food for discussion, hopefully. So what I will do is I will first take you back to the crisis decade and to my initial encounter with the wall writing that sparked this whole project on the middle voice. And I will talk about two wall writings in that context, and then I will move in the final part to the, let's say, post-crisis Greece context. So in crisis times, binary understandings of subjects or situations find a lot of fertile ground. Perpetrators and victims, active versus passive, powerful versus powerless, guilty versus innocent, or normal versus abnormal, queer or weird. And during the Greek debt crisis then, there were a lot of popular narratives around this crisis that took many different forms, but I kind of distinguish two general tendencies in these narratives. One of these tendencies casts the Greek subjects as either as active and the other one as passive, to put it simply. So on the one hand, we have the moralistic narrative of the tax evading, the lazy, money squandering Greeks who brought the crisis upon themselves and are guilty and deserving of their plight. It's a narrative very popular in the European North. And this is a narrative that sees the Greeks as active agents responsible for the crisis, albeit in need of European patronage. On the other hand, we have narratives of the crisis as systemic, mostly from the left. And again, I'm simplifying for the sake of the argument here, that often use this trope of passive victimhood. So Greeks as victims of a bankrupt political system or of finance capitalism, or as pawns in a global system that neutralizes resistance. Now, these accounts draw from two versions of subjectivity. The first one on the idea of the autonomous, free-willed, the liberal subject, master of their destiny. And the second one on the subject as determined by discursive or ideological forces. And the most dominant narrative was actually the former one, because it's legitimized austerity politics and a rather punitive attitude towards Greeks. So, and generally speaking, neoliberal crisis rhetoric needs this grammar of autonomous subjectivity, because capitalism needs to sustain this illusion of free will so that it can expand uninhibited, while its destructive effects can then be attributed to naughty or irresponsible nations or individuals. My research into the middle voice in relation to the Greek crisis started with this very resonant encounter with wall writing in my hometown in Thessaloniki in 2011, which kind of grasped me in a way I couldn't quite understand. And the project emerged actually as an attempt to grapple with this encounter. The writing featured the by now very well-known verb vasanizome, which is best translated as I am in torment. And it could be found anywhere, or actually everywhere in Greece, in Athens, in Thessaloniki, in other cities, in different versions. I will show you some examples. This is from Athens, so covering the whole wall of a building, or smaller versions. In some cases, it's followed by a full stop. In most cases, it was followed by 3 ellipsis marks, as you will see. So also on the windows of bankrupt businesses, garbage containers, on the doorsteps, everywhere where you could find it as a tag or a kind of footnote to other graffiti, etc. So, and its circulation moved quickly to the internet. It was collected on different sites, commented upon. There were memes circulating with vasanizome. And although I still don't know who initiated this, there is no doubt that with this very vast proliferation, that it was eventually spread by different individuals and street artists. Basically, it turned to the most iconic wall writing of the crisis. So how did Vasanism intervene in the Greek crisis rhetoric? In most political wall writings, there is an addressee, the police or the state, marked usually as the perpetrator. But in Vasanism, things are different. The message is very introspective. It says something about the condition of the subject, so the I of the verb Vasanism. So the I is also affected by the action, is the one who suffers. And this is typical of middle voice constructions in which the subject is inside the action and is affected by it. So here I owe you a small explication of what the middle voice is about, very briefly. So as you probably know, most Indo-European languages today have two voices, the active and the passive. John chased the dog was chased by John, the passive voice. But ancient Greek and other ancient Indo-European languages also had a middle voice as a morphologically distinct category. And that category vanished later with modernity from most modern languages, suppressed by the active-passive binary. And so while most Indo-European languages today only have this binary distinction between the active and the passive voice, semantically, the middle voice still survives. So it's expressed through active or passive verbs or other grammatical constructions. So what happens in the middle voice is that if, for example, in the active voice, the action takes place outside the subject, in the middle voice, the subject remains inside the action. Something happens to the subject as well. So in middle voice constructions in English, I have some examples here on the screen. Let's say John sacrificed himself or his family, or the boat sunk, or Paris is burning. John and the boat and Paris are subjects who also undergo something. And the subject, the middle voice, always occupies a space of both agency and patiency. This is central to the argument too. Now, this subject position has epistemological and also ethical and political implications, and this is what interests me here. And to tease out these implications, I use the middle voice in a broader sense, not just in a grammatical sense, as this expressive mode or conceptual infrastructure that could produce alternative understandings of subjectivity or agency and relationality. And to do that, I take my cue from a bunch of theories, mostly from post-structuralist theory, but also feminist and sociological approaches who have people who have theorized the middle voice in philosophical terms, such as Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida and Hayden White, La Capra, Vincent Pecora, Giorgio Agamben, Lucy Irigaray, and Hartmut Rosa. So in post-structuralist thoughts, the middle voice is usually this area of undecidability that resists binary oppositions, like those between active or passive, but also the victim, perpetrator, or object and subject. And also accommodates more fluid understandings of subjectivity as neither active nor passive. I also draw from Hartmut Rosa's theory of resonance, where the middle voice becomes a mode of relating to even bigger, so a mode of relating to the world or relating to others in a way that he calls resonant. So what is that? In very briefly, this resonance in Hartmut Rosa's theory is a two-directional movement of reaching out and being reached, in which, or actually, as he calls it, a form of active receptivity and of being in the world, whereby subjects, and I quote, experience themselves as being neither omnipotent nor powerless, but rather as semi-empowered, end quote. All right, so back to Vasanism. The agent here that causes this suffering is ambiguous in this construction. It can be the subject, I'm tormenting myself, but it can also be somebody else. Somebody else is tormenting me. So the subject can either be responsible for the suffering or the victim of another tormentor. So the middle voice doesn't usually assign clear-cut positions of patient or agent. and doesn't identify the cause of the action, but stresses the action itself or the act itself. So the individual suffering, which here becomes collective by being shared on the city's walls. So what happens here is that this writing also countered this obsession in crisis rhetoric with judgment of the guilty and ascription of blame. So here's what a blogger wrote about Vassanism back in 2012, I think. Let me check. Yeah. This is from a blog. Nobody knows for this is my translation. Nobody knows for sure who is behind this, nor what its initial concept was. Now, however, we suspect that it exists in order to remind us that we are not suffering alone. It's there in order to divide our insecurities, our sorrows, our guilt, our disappointments into a million pieces, so that we each get one of these pieces and breathe, even for that short moment when we face it. Now, the encounter that this blogger describes seems like this form of fragmentation, but it's actually the opposite, I would say. It is what Rosa calls a resonant experience that effectively connects the writing with other viewers in a community grounded in the sharing of suffering. Our sorrows, our guilt, our insecurities, our disappointments, they say. So the experience of being able to breathe at the moment of this encounter suggests a shift from suffocation or from alienation to a relation where the subject is moved, responds to this address, and undergoes a transformative experience that connects it to others through shared suffering. So in the experience that Vassanism triggers, private suffering spills over to the public and becomes political, not only as a critique or the population suffering from the crisis, but also as a basis for another community grounded in vulnerability. And in their edited volume, Vulnerability in Resistance, Judith Butler, Zeynep Kambeti, and Leticia Sapsay challenge common views on vulnerability as passivity, as victimization, as lack of agency, which all evoke this vocabulary of the passive voice, and reclaim it as a site of agency and a condition for resistance, especially in feminist and queer politics. This rapprochement between vulnerability, agency, and resistance can only take place beyond the active and passive binary that ties activity to masculinity and passivity to femininity. So vulnerability, bodily exposure can generate new modes of agency that move away from masculinist fantasies of mastery. And this is also one of the things that I think makes the middle voice theory quite important for queer strategies of resistance. So the subject in Vassanism is neither autonomous nor a victim. The middle voice here yields this understanding of agency grounded in relationality rather than autonomy or mastery. And it is a form of agency that could also help voice experiences of those most afflicted by the crisis, dispossessed subjects beyond the common trope of victimhood. So I'm just showing some visuals from this one is a meta reflection of Vassanism from the wall of my former high school in Thessaloniki. Moving on to the second wall writing, which gives us another take on crisis ordinariness. Βαριέμαι φάνταστα. Βαριέμαι means I'm bored, while the adverb fantasta can refer to creative imagination or imaginary stories and lies. So this translates as I'm bored imaginatively or fancifully. Again, the verb is a middle voice construction as the subject is involved in the process, but we could actually see this whole phrase as cast in the middle voice mode because we have passivity and inaction associated with boredom combined with creativity and imagination, which suggests a subject that's like both active and passive. This writing also appeared during the crisis. It wasn't as popular as Vassanism and not anywhere near that popularity. I've found 2 renditions in Athens. I'm quite sure there were more though. And you could take this the context of boredom, you could connect it to a kind of consumerist lifestyle, but you can also connect it to the enforced idleness of unemployment that had skyrocketed in Greece during the crisis. And I think that this latter context, so the boredom of unemployment, is more in tune also with the neighborhood of Exarchia, where this writing appeared, which is home to unemployed youth and has this air of resistance to power, clashes with the police, but also a lot of self-organized initiatives happening there. And a lot of commentary on the internet on this also connects it to unemployment. So this is a screenshot from another blog called The Diary of an Unemployed, which uses this wall writing as a title for one of the entries back in 2010. So what happens here is that this writing invests the passivity of unemployment with the activity of imagination, which might resist conditions of precarity and disposability. But I'm interested in the terms of this resistance. So what is happening here exactly? The phrase twists another common phrase in Greek, varieme afandasta. And I hope that doesn't hold for the audience here. You're still with me, which basically means I'm unimaginably bored to death. So in the wall writing, the prefix a, which signifies lack, is replaced with the prefix f, which indicates something positive. So this replacement reinstates the imagination, fantasia, that is only present negatively in afandasta. So the late capitalist ennui of unimaginable boredom produces here an imaginative use of that boredom to protest the conditions that induced it. So if the neoliberal criteria of a good life are fixated upon economic growth or reproduction or production, then varieme afandasta, revises the terms of this good life. It invests precarious subjects with the capacity to imagine, to dream, to twist conditions of abjection through the only thing that they actually have, which is time. So time here can be used, the writing suggests, imaginatively instead of productively as part of a person's capital. So imaginative boredom suggests to me also moving away, a disengagement even from what Lauren Berlant calls the cruel optimism of attachments to upward mobility or job security or other good life fantasies that are untenable within conditions of crisis. And this is, other works, other interlocutors of that wall writing, studies on capitalism and work, critiques of capitalism and work, like Harry Cleaver's Struggle Against Work, or Nick Cernicek and Williams's manifesto, Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism and a World Without Work. So it converses with his works, and the use of the middle voice here is reconfiguring boredom into an experience that becomes a form of resistance. It becomes a kind of stasis. So the suspended action of boredom that boredom suggests becomes a form of resistance here that also has a whiff of utopianism even. The word fantasia also links this to, or the whole writing is linked also to Gilles Debord's wall writing, Ne travaillez jamais, Never Work, on the wall of Rue de Seine in Paris from 1952, that also came to play an important role in the events of May 68. And the word fantasia in Fantasta also activates this memory of the May 68 slogan, all power to the imagination, and tries to transfer some of this utopian energy on our post-1989 world of what Mark Fisher has called capitalist realism, that supposedly precludes the imagination of alternatives. I think the utopianism in Varieme Fandasta is, however, quite different from the utopianism of May 68, of that slogan of May 68. The subject in Varieme Fandasta, which is a subject in the middle voice, is internal to the late capitalist conditions that induce boredom and is implicated in the system it resists. So if the kind of revolutionary utopianism of May 68 seems untenable in our post-revolutionary world, then maybe utopianism and resistance can be channeled today through different grammars. So in a way, Varjeme Fantasta revises utopianism in this late capitalist context through the middle voice. And I would say that it even kind of refashions the boredom of capitalist realism into what Munoz has called the queer utopianism, and this illumination that helps us sense the not yet conscious as a utopian feeling in certain representational practices. And instead of optimism, a writing like this, I think, cultivates hope. And hope, according to Terry Eagleton and others, actually needs or is based on future uncertainty. Right? The optimism is this banal, naive attitude that underpins the progress doctrine, the belief that things will keep getting better, even if we know they probably won't. Whereas hope involves the possibility of failure, but also the belief in the possibility of change. So Varjeme, the conditions of late capitalism, the fantasta, the hope that it might be different, things might be different. All right, to the conclusion, the last and final part. Let me check. Can I take another 5 minutes? So claims that Greece's exit from the bailout program in August 2018 meant the end of the crisis sounds somewhat ironic if we consider the persisting conditions of, precarity, broken infrastructures that suggest that a crisis in Greece remains an enduring state rather than a thing of the past. But as I said in the beginning, the narrative has shifted toward this, official governmental narrative of happiness and growth and rebuilding. Since the New Democracy Party became the ruling party, the Greek public sphere, as Soudias and Katsinas claim, moved away from moralizing discourses of guilt and blame and debt towards a new imaginary of happiness that is part of this rebranding of the country for the tourist industry, but also a means of disciplining the population. So what remains today? That's the question I pose now for the final conclusion. What remains from the contrarian grammars of the writings I discussed? And my focus is here on Vasanizome, which is actually the writing that has the most persistent presence even today. Actually, it is a writing that also been multiply adapted in literature. Here is the theatrical adaptation. It has been used in literary works, in art installations. You could say that it has entered the cultural archive of the crisis. But it's not just that. I believe it still has a function in the present that takes us beyond, it being an emblem for a past era. So there are new appearances of Vasanizome. I am from Thessaloniki, so I've been tracing them there. What I'm showing you now are from the last couple of years. Even one in Tbilisi in Georgia that a friend shared with me. So this suggests maybe this transnational network of dissemination. The presence of Vasanizome today could be seen as a refusal of this narrative of happiness, when happiness in this narrative becomes a very normative category that, following Sarah Ahmed, rests on ideas of who is worthy or capable of being happy in the right way, in the heteronormative way, and make sure that only the right people have access to this happiness. So in that respect, it might be no coincidence that a great number of new appearances of Vasanizome I found in Thessaloniki are actually at public construction sites that involve rebuilding, repair of making new infrastructures. And public construction projects in Greece are notoriously slow and stagnant, sometimes closing off streets for weeks or months or years without any progress. Perhaps the most striking example of such a project is the Thessaloniki Metro, which is being built supposedly since the 1980s. And it's been stalled, its construction, for many, many different reasons. It's been announced that it will open in 2024, but I've also read reports that the funding has been frozen, that contractors have abandoned the project. So let's see. Now, against this backdrop, what I've described, the description of this project on the website of Ελληνικό Metro, which is the company responsible for its construction, is telling. Here, the metro is presented as the largest, and I quote, you can see it here, the largest transport, development, and environmental infrastructure project currently under construction in our country, that upon completion will be the most modern metro system in Europe, making Thessaloniki a modern European city. So the project is framed through this confident narrative of growth and modernization of Greece's second largest city. And the presence of vasanisome on temporary surfaces at the metro's construction site on Egnatia Street in Thessaloniki in 2022, this is from there, actually intimates the underside of this modernizing imperative and the well-known predicament also of Greece's incomplete modernization. So the contradiction between the state of the metro and the narrative framing that I just showed to you exemplifies the cruel optimism that the country's new narrative cultivates, this attachment to the promise of happiness and good life despite all these ailing infrastructures. In this context, vasanisome highlights the inconsistencies of new dominant narratives and the need for alternatives. But, and I close with this point, it's not just the function of vasanisome is not just a critique. It's not just an expression, I think, of what some would call a miserabilism by those banished from heteronormative happiness narratives as troublemakers or dissenters or killers of joy. It can be seen as a basis for new collectives that claim agency through vulnerability and refuse the attachment to being happy in the right way, mobilizing imaginative boredom to sustain the hope for alternatives from within conditions of crisis, ordinariness. So we'll leave it here. Thanks, and sorry for taking so long.
Thank you, Maria, and absolutely no worries. It is our final session, so we can take it easy. Thank you so much for this big walk amongst affects, infrastructures, and the exploration of alternative agencies through the middle voice. We will have a lot to discuss. So now we will move on to our second speaker, Vera Gheno. Vera will be speaking on the following subject. Is there a problem with Italian? The challenges of a binary language facing a fluid reality. So from the binarism from the binarism of active and passive voice to the binarism of gender. Vera Gheno is a social linguist. She has collaborated with the Accademia della Crusca for 20 years. After 18 years as a contractor in various universities, since the end of 2021, she's a researcher at the University of Florence. In 2023, she edited the volume Parole d'altro genere, come le scrittrici hanno cambiato il mondo, published also Galateo della comunicazione, and L'antidoto, 15 comportamenti che avvelenano la nostra vita online e come evitarli. Gramananti immaginare futuri con le parole was published in April 2024. Vera deals mainly with technical mediated communication, gender issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Vera, we're yours.
Okay, thank you. I have to say that my presentation will be, in a way, a more basic, dealing with a subject that is commonly discussed, I think, nowadays. I just need to share the presentation. Here we are. And, well, the starting point is this. This image I use a lot with my students, and I also use a lot when I try to popularize the issue of, the explosion of gender identity, or how do you want to call it. this image has a very good reception among younger generations. When I'm teaching at the university, they kind of understand it, kind of understand the complexity of gender identity. When I try to share it outside the university with maybe older people, senior members of the society, it seems to be a very difficult topic to understand. So I just wanted to start from this, just to make it clear which one is the context in which I'm trying to do my work of charting this uncharted linguistic territory in a way. And for me, another very good starting point is this quotation by Guy Deutscher, because it kind of highlights what is the issue in Italian, but also in all the other, Romance languages and much more, basically all those languages that have grammatical gender. Deutscher says, well, if I say in English, I spent yesterday evening with a neighbor, I do not have to inform the person I'm talking to about the sex or the gender of my neighbor. I can leave that. And if somebody asks me about it, I can also say, well, this is none of your business. Whereas there are other languages, Deutscher quotes French or German, but for Italian, it's exactly the same, in which we have to inform the people around us all the time about the gender of people we are talking about, because we don't have a non-gendered version of the name. So I have to say vicino or vicina, which means male neighbor or female neighbor, and the same in French or German. Does this change in a way the structure of our thought? I would say so, because when I do this experiment with my students and I ask them to translate very quickly this English sentence, most of them will translate it with the masculine form. Ho passato la serata di ieri con un vicino. Now, the mental narrative you have about me spending the evening with a male neighbor is very specific. Somebody might think about a romantic involvement, whereas if I say that I spent the evening with a female neighbor, the mental narrative changes completely. Either I just came out as a lesbian, or I'm telling you that I had one of those girly nights, maybe binge watching Sex and the City or whatever. But you see how much does come through, do we tell the others through this genderization, this constant genderization of language. So what Deutscher says is, it's not that English people cannot see the difference between evenings spent with male or female neighbors. It's more that some languages force you to think in a certain way, or force you to give out certain information about the people you are talking about. So this is what we are discussing right now in Italian, which, as probably you might know, is a gendered language. So both names and pronouns are gendered, and we don't have any residual form, structural residual form of the Latin neutral, which, by the way, was used only for objects or concepts, abstract concepts, and never for people. So maybe what we are looking right now in Italian is something that can be compared to the English singular they. English doesn't use it for people. So it's a little bit the same issue also in Italian. So when is it that Italian, or we could say French, or Spanish, all these languages are not enough? When I don't know the gender of the person I'm talking about. In English, I can say somebody left their umbrella here. In Italian, I will say qualcuno using the overextended masculine. If I find out that qualcuno was Alice, then I say, oh, è stata Alice. Okay, so qualcuno ha lasciato quell'ombrello, è stata Alice. But in the first instance, I have used the overextended masculine. It's kind of automatic for an Italian. I would never say qualcuno o qualcuna. Then the second instance is when I'm referring to a mixed multitude of persons. The first version would be buonasera a tutti, welcome to everybody, but tutti is a masculine form. If I want to be more polite, I would say buonasera a tutte e tutti. First the feminine version and then the masculine version, but tutte e tutti still leaves out a part of a population, those who do not identify in the masculine or in the feminine form, okay? And then a more specific problem arises when I'm referring to a person which identifies outside the binary gender. So if I'm faced with Mason Alexander Park or some other non-binary person, I would have the problem how to address them, because I am forced by my language to use either the masculine or the feminine form, okay? So I would like to point out that this is no longer a merely lexical question. It's not about how I call people, which words I use for people. It's a morphological question. And the big issue here is it possible to change the morphology of a language? Many people will say no. I am not sure about a definite answer, because I think that a lot could change if, instead of a small minority of people not identifying inside the gender binary, the percentage, what will happen if the percentage grows a lot? What if 30% of people in Italy will start to go around and not identify themselves as masculine or feminine, as male or female? That would be very interesting to be witness of, from my point of view. But I'm very, pacified, because I'm intrigued about what is happening to the concept of anatomical or biological sex versus gender identity. So for me, whatever happens, as long as people are happy with that, I'm okay with that. I'm an observer. I'm a linguist. Okay, I'm an ally of the queer community. So it would not be an issue for me, but as you will see now in the next slides, not everybody is this zened out like me in front of this topic, of this issue. So just to give you some context, I am not the first person to deal with what is happening in Italian right now. Actually, I have a small timeline here to share with you. And first of all, between 2005 and 2010, many LGBTQIA+ communities started to ponder about this question of, how to address people of their communities who were starting to identify themselves outside the gender binary. So in the moment that in my queer community, a non-binary, a gender fluid, a gender flux person comes out, how do I make them feel naturally part of the queer community? And so the different communities around Italy started to experiment with several symbols, like the asterisk, the @ sign, which mimics the use that is also current in Spanish and Portuguese, along with the E, todes. You probably have seen todos, todas, todes, but sometimes you also find the arroba, the @ sign, the slash, the X, the Y. Now, most of these solutions have a big limit, and the limit is that they are not pronounceable. So I can write them. I can use the asterisk in writing, buonasera a tutti, asterisco. But how do I translate that to the orality when I speak? So there are two uses that became generalized in speech. One is the U in the end of the word, because that's the only vowel which is free from the morphological system in Italy. We don't use it in standard Italian as a morphological marker of singular, plural, or masculine, feminine. And then the schwa. So I am constantly quoted as the inventor of the schwa in this use, but I am not. I only picked it up on an academic level, trying to study what happened to the schwa. Now, what does this mean? I can say buonasera a tutti instead of buonasera a tutte e tutti, and I can say buonasera a tutti with this schwa sound, which is, sitting in the middle of this of the scheme of the vowels. So it's this medium sound that you can pronounce without moving around your mouth, basically. Okay, and this happens, 10 to 15 to 20 years ago. What happens in 2015 is that we have a sort of a first sign of regularization of this use in a proposal that was sent around via a Google Doc circulating a little bit underground on the internet. A Google Doc that was written by Luca Boschetto, who is not a linguist. He's a member of the polyamory community, actually. So he has something to do with the queerness. He's a member of the community, I would say. And in this Google document, Luca Boschetto suggested the use of the short schwa, this E for the singular, and the long schwa, which looks a little bit like a 3 for the plural. They are pronounced basically in the same way. So, for example, I use the schwa, I only use the short schwa, both for singular and plural, because as you know, Italian phrases need a lot of, I'd say there are many parts of the phrase that have to be connected together. So you don't really need, for my point of view, you don't really need two different symbols for singular and plural, because you understand if you are dealing with singular or plural by the context, the pronoun, the articles, the verbs, and so on. Anyway, what happens next is that I was unaware of what had happened so far. In 2019, I have written a book which is called Femminili Singolari, singular feminines, which deals with the question of the emergence of feminine nomina agentis, the names of professions in Italian, like ministra or assessora or segretaria, instead of the standard masculine forms that had been used so far. And there is a big discussion about this. And in that context, in a half a page, I just made reference to the use of the schwa, and you will see it in the next slide. But it's a very short reference because I was asked by a non-binary person how could they identify themselves in this binary system. But I had I had not made real research about the topic. It was just a thing I said publicly. I said out loudly publicly, and I had not really thought about the issue at all until that moment. But you see soon, and maybe this would have stayed, a once in a lifetime thing. But the same publishing house that published my Femminili Singolari decided in 2020 to translate a very nice feminist pamphlet by Marcia Tiburi. Marcia Tiburi is a Brazilian feminist, so the pamphlet is written in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese. And in that pamphlet, Tiburi uses the inclusive form which is present in Spanish and in Portuguese, which is todes, okay? Todos, todas, todes. And the publisher house and the translator, Eloisa De Giudice, were pondering about what to use as a equally experimental form in Italian to mirror that experimental form in Portuguese. And so they settled for the schwa, because they had have written about the schwa the year before. And so the translation came out as tutte, tutte e tutti, with the use of the schwa. And it is kind of the debut of the schwa on the scene of Italian culture, I would say. And then in the 26th of July 2020, we have the spillover. I mean with this that the issue spills out of the LGBTQAI plus context and becomes a topic of discussion for the general public. You will see in the next two slides these two documents. Now, this is the piece from Femminili Singolari. I have translated it for you, but as you can see, I am very generic. I am not really scientific about the issue. I'm just saying that sometimes ago I proposed, but I was not the first to do so, to use the schwa, the indistinctive vowel, which in the International Phonetic Alphabet is with the symbol written with the symbol and so you can, just a half of a page. But this is also the first time I talk about the schwa. And this is also why I am credited with the first application of the schwa to refer to non-binary people. But actually, when I wrote this, I was aware that I was not the first to write about this, but I was unaware of the full story of the schwa. So it has been fascinating for me to discover that it was used 10 years before, 10, 15 years before, and I am not really part of the queer community, so I had not discovered it until I went to study the subject. Now, this is 2019. This is the piece from 2020. It's a very small journalistic piece, I would say a cultural piece written by Mattia Feltri, who is a famous journalist in Italy. And I don't want to stay on this because it would be very nice to analyze it properly, but I leave you the slides so you can study all the piece as much as you want. But you can understand from the first lines that it is an ironic piece. So basically it says, we don't need this stuff. We all sound like Laurel and Hardy if we pick up the schwa. It's something invented artificially, but by a person, and it's not really needed by the community. And it says a lot of untrue things. But the problem is that the Italian society sort of receives an imprinting by this piece, which was published on a national newspaper. And it has been very difficult since 2020 to change the narrative around the schwa. So this is, outside the queer contexts, this is the first instance in which the schwa is quoted to the general public. And of course, the general public picks up only the most extreme pieces of it, building like a sort of gigantic strawman argument, which I'm still fighting against after all these years, okay? So what do the critical voices say in those years? For example, that it is unnecessary because it concerns only a very small minority of persons. 2% says Cecilia Robustelli, one of our leading experts of gender studies. Gender studies in a very traditional form, feminine versus masculine. Apparently, this small minority who needs the schwa is not part of the community of speakers, according to what Robustelli says. See, she creates, an opposition between the community of speakers and those who use the schwa, as if they were outside the community. And then Massimo Arcangeli, these are all linguists, says that it's only a fashion trend. It's fashionable to talk about the schwa, but again, it's not really needed. Also, Arcangeli speaks of the topic as a violation of language, a rape of language. So I'd like to highlight here the terms used. As if the language were raped by the use of schwa and these other experimental solutions. And then Paolo D'Achille, who is currently the president of the Accademia della Crusca, argues that masculine has been traditionally used instead of a missing neutral form, so why should we change? What amuses me is that we never get to the point of discussing why the masculine is used for a neutral. So is this maybe connected to the androcentrism of our society? I think so, but apparently not everybody thinks the same. Arcangeli again says that these experiments are not grassroots and are created artificially by, suppose, elite of speakers. It would be the gay and queer elite. I don't really see that around that much, but whatever. But what is interesting is that this is untrue, because as I showed you in the last slides, it has been grassroots, actually. It was born inside the communities. So this is one of the main strawman arguments I find in Italy all the time. And also, more people like Roberto D'Alessandro, Arcangeli again, but also Raffaele Simone, these are all leading linguists in Italy, say that people who suggest these solutions are not linguists and are ignorant, i.e. I am ignorant. So the question posed here is that only expert can manipulate languages? But this is in contrast with what Robustelli was arguing in another essay, that these are not grassroots movements, so they have to be disregarded for that reason. So you see that they also say opposite things that go in opposition between themselves. And then also the experiments want to, for Robustelli, the experiments want to cancel masculine and feminine genders and want to make everybody, fluid, neutral, which is untrue, because we are adding new ways of expressing somebody's gender, but not canceling anything. I mean, if somebody feels a male or a female, everybody's cool with that. It's just adding something. So why did this cancellation narrative come out? How is that after all these years, even very cultured people continue to bring on this hoax of the schwa or the you as ways of uniforming everybody, and making everybody indistinct? It is completely not true. And finally, Roberto D'Alessandro also argues that the schwa cannot be taught to children, and thus it cannot become part of the norm. I beg to dissent here, but because we don't have data on this, actually. So we need the empirical data on the fact that really it's not possible to teach to children. But the other question is, and I will pick it up in the end of my presentation, which is almost there, do we need to make the schwa part of the norm? Because for me, it has a different meaning. It has the meaning of staying outside the norm, but I will clarify in a few slides what I'm trying to say here. Then we get to the acme of the story. In February 2022, Massimo Arcangeli publishes a petition against the schwa, which is called Lo schwa no grazie pro lingua nostra. Schwa no thanks for our language. Nostra, apparently our, means only ours, not of those ugly queer people who want to experiment with language. And I only want to show you the beginning. You can read it in English, just to feel the kind of language used. We're talking about the dangerous drift, passed off as a desire for inclusiveness, but incompetent in linguistic matters, who would like to reform Italian with the sound of the schwa, and the madness bent under the banner of political correctness, blah, blah, blah. You can see it's very, how do you say, unpolite language. It has a lot of reference to violence in a way. So the movement of the schwa for Massimo Arcangeli and the 25,000 people that signed the petition is that they are violent and try to impose to all the rest of the community a use. Of course, this is untrue, but many people signed this petition, not as many as maybe the promoters wanted, but a lot of very important names actually signed the petition as well. Some names amuse me. You can find the petition online, so you can watch you can look it up for yourself. Just a few last slides. The symbolical power of the schwa can be maybe understood through this sticker that was plastered around the University of Turin last year. The sticker was made by one of the left-right student movements that are present in our universities, which is called Fuan Aliud, a neo-fascist formation. And you see it's like a Ghostbusters sign. It says, keep your university clean. And we have a rainbow schwa crossed over. And this means that, the university has to be kept clean, not by the schwa itself, but what the schwa represents, which is the queerness. Okay, so basically this sticker reads, keep queer people out of the university, keep queerness out of the university. Of course, the administration of the University of Turin took these stickers off. And so we had many newspapers talking about what happened. And this is a right-wing politician, Susanna Ceccardi, who, by the way, sits in the European Parliament, who shares this piece of news, this title by Libero, which is a right-ish newspaper. And you see how the narrative is turned upside down. The students want to write in Italian, meaning they refuse to use the schwa, and so they are accused of being fascists. Now, nobody imposed them to write with the schwa. Actually, the sticker was made by a right-wing group of students. So what we are talking about. But this is the way the narrative is always twisted around. No? And what they are always trying to convey is that there is a movement which is trying to impose the use of these experimental forms of language, which is completely, totally untrue. In the meanwhile, since 2020 to today, several books, like monographies, were published, all against the use of the schwa. So the schwa became the symbol of the inclusive language from a gender point of view. We have Massimo Arcangeli, La lingua scema, the stupid language, but written with the schwa. Then we have Andrea De Benedetti, another leading linguist in Italy, Così non schwa. It cannot go this way, but again, we have a calembour in the title. Then we have another linguist from Sardinia, Yasmina Pani, who wrote schwa, a solution without a problem. We don't have a problem whatsoever. Then we have another one. It's not like it seems, but again, you see the schwa instead of the e of the copula. The non-inclusivity of inclusive language. And finally, we have another book by Massimo Arcangeli, which is Genderless Grammar, How to Promote Inclusivity Without Destroying Languages. And again, I want to underline, highlight the use of the words destroying languages. So as soon as we try to reach out of the norm, we become destructors of language, which is kind of interesting for me. So what happens outside books and outside, universities and the cultural contexts is that the schwa is going around on walls of the cities. This is a graffiti by anarchists that I found it in Florence, in my hometown. And you can see it says Stato assassino, so the state is a killer, tutte libere, everybody free. It's about the disincarceration of anarchists that are in jail right now. So everybody free. It's not liberi tutti with the overextended masculine, but is written with the schwa. And I have several examples of these wild uses of the schwa, whatever academicians, linguists, and everybody else say in the cultural world of Italy. So, in conclusion, the matter is rejected by the majority of the academia. It's not considered a relevant topic to study, and I'm considered just an unexperienced fool, probably, to go around speaking of this. I find that there is a very big double strawman argument, branding the schwa as an artificial creation. What does it mean? I mean, everything in language is sort of artificial in a way, and also that it would be a creation by an elite, which is not, and also that it would be imposed to the community of speakers, which is, again, not real, not true. The discussion is unfortunately centered on the systematization of the use of the schwa. So what happens if the schwa becomes part of the norm, of the grammar? What if we have to teach it in school? But maybe the sense of the schwa is that of being a symbol, a symptom of something, of a disalignment between a binary grammar that was formed in a binary world and the need for something more. But probably, and I am very zen with that. The Schwa is not the solution. It's just something that shows the existence of an issue. And for me, it could peacefully stay outside the norm without becoming a new norm, just highlighting the limits of it. As you might remember, in the 70s, a group of historians, people who studied history, women who studied history, started to talk about her story instead of the history. And of course, they didn't want to make it a new word. They were just playing around with the fact that history begins with his, to retell the history from a feminist and feminine point of view. And so they talked about her story. And for me, the Schwa is a little bit like her story. We don't have to think it as part of the grammar. We have to think it as something outside the grammar that shows us how much the grammar is limiting right now the kaleidoscopic queerness of a human person, of human beings. And of course, I don't have time to explore the issue, but I myself use the Schwa very scarcely because I know that it's not something that everybody can understand. Brigitte Vassallo, as well as Franco Berardi, talked about semio-capitalism, which is the capitalism of the sign. And I don't want that the linguistic use becomes a sort of new norm that, again, cuts out exactly those who I'm fighting for. Now, the lowest parts of the more fragile parts of the society. Okay, there is a lot to say about this, but probably in another speech I will have the time to talk about the semio-capitalism. But I think it's a very cool concept, which I hope that makes you curious about knowing more. So I just wanted to end with a quote I really love from a book I really love, which is this: "If our language works for us, we do not perceive the substance of our thinking. We do not see the architecture of our language. We perceive the walls and limits of language only when it no longer works, only when it forces us, when it takes the air away from us to breathe." Now, I have the feeling that many people in my academic world, as well as in my society, are so lucky from a linguistic point of view that they don't need to perceive the substance of language. They don't need to perceive the walls that are built by language and by power structures in language. So this is why I will continue to be very vocal about the Schwa and everything it opens up with its use. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vera, for giving us a flavor of what is happening with the discussion on non-binary language in Italian, and on problematizing the experiments, the alternatives, but also the backlash that this discussion has encountered. So we have 10 minutes for questions. If you have questions for either Maria or Vera, feel free to raise your hand and ask the question yourself, or to type it in the chat, and we will read it out for you. In the meantime, as perhaps some of you are preparing your questions, I will take the lead. So I want, Maria, I want to go back to you and use Vera's presentation as a lens. So you talked to us about the subjects of the verbs of these graffitis: Vasanizo me, I'm insolent, and Varieme fadesta, I'm bored imaginatively. In terms of class, for instance, they are unemployed subjects during the crisis. What about gender? Have we any idea how gender plays in the middle voice, in the subject? The middle voice is gendered.
Yeah, I had to think about that also in the framework of this seminar series, to be honest, Billy. What I've read around, in responses to either Vasanism or Varieme Fandasta online or, in commentary, I cannot recall coming across an explicit reflection on whether the subject of these verbs is gendered. So this in itself might actually be interesting. Of course, I mean, they are both expressions of countercultural, or at least, before, you could argue with Vassanism, it became so widespread that it kind of, took another function. But they are both expressions, or studied off as expressions of countercultural projects, desires, conditions, etc. So in that sense, I took it, especially in both cases, actually, not as they can definitely be kind of associated with those in society who have no part in, let's say, the distribution of the sensible, and that includes people who either do not identify with the kind of active masculinist roles, or the feminine passive roles, to speak in those terms, but are looking for positions of subjectivity and agency somewhere in a space in between those two. And this of course also speaks to pursuits that are very central to the queer theory, queer communities. So in that sense, I think it does speak to the pursuits, to the projects that are central to gender and queer theory as well.
But that's what I was thinking as well, that somehow moving beyond the binary of agency grasps in its nets the non-binary of gender.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have a question. Oh, it's from Lisa. Okay.
Okay. Maybe this is better. Okay. I have a question actually for Vera, coming from the Italian context, and I was, fascinated by Arcangeli's idea that there is an elite promoting gender inclusive language, and it kind of reminded me of what Massimo Prearo told us 3 weeks ago about there's like a similar discourse saying that there is this gender movement in Italy, and that this kind of trying to promote gender neutrality, especially for children, and that we should go against it and kind of protect traditional families and traditional values. And I was just wondering, why do you think the narrative became structured as there is this elite trying to promote gender inclusive language? Because then if we look at the facts, it's used frequently by FQ, who's an Italian publishing company, and it was used by Michela Murgia in her editorials. But other than this, and outside of collectives, it's not very much used. So I was wondering how this kind of both the gender ideology movement, that was the word that I was looking for, and the gender inclusive elite came about.
Well, maybe thinking of it as an elite movement makes it more easy to reject, because if it comes from above, then, we as the speakers community, we must keep together and, go against this common enemy. And I'm thinking a lot about what Bauman said about I don't know how it's in English actually, comunità attaccapanni, hanger communities, maybe, I don't know, because it's the communities that find a new way of staying together against a common enemy. So, the gay, queer, trans elite is the common enemy, is a common enemy number one right now in Italy. And it's so much easier, to fight against a common enemy instead of just facing the truth that the queerness is among us. We are basically, everybody's in a way is queer. It's just that not everybody is exploring the queerness inside themselves, but it's easier to deal with an outside, to outsource the source of your problems. And what I'm fascinated about is that when first these discussions came out, I believed in knowledge. I was 100% sure that intelligent people who have studied, would step up against this narrative, not embracing it. Especially because, I mean, I worked a lot with the people who are in gender studies, and for me, going from feminist gender studies to queer gender studies was seamless. Instead, I found out, and it was a shock for me, that these studies I was making were disturbing for the feminist scholars I have been studying with my whole life. And so now it's perceived that there is a war between the queer people and women. I mean, the essentialist feminists, I don't want to say trans-excluding radical feminists, but I would say essentialist feminist, uterism. I call it uterism. And so, yeah, I think there is a sort of alliance right now between how do you say, a more conservative view of society and of family values and what is a man and what is a woman, and some parts of feminism. So queer studies are crushed between these two. It's a very interesting position to be in, because I had no idea when I started to study the issue that this would be the direction it would take, the discussion would take. But yeah, going back to your question, I think that it's a commodity to have an enemy outside the decent binary society.
Yeah, Mariam, go ahead. And then it was not a hand. Okay.
I withdraw because there's another hand.
Okay. Michaela, yes.
Sorry, yeah, my camera is on there. Thank you very much.
We can't hear you. I think that the connection is unstable.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Now we can hear you clearly.
Okay, there was a plug and plug because I just come back from a trip, so I haven't plugged everything. So I was saying, thank you very much for your presentation, Maria, because it reminds me of my studies of Greek and modern Greek. So I've learned a lot about the middle voice, and I got just memories of this. So it was nice to see a discussion of that in conjunction with the Crises and also with Lauren Berlant. My question is for. I really like how you finish your presentation saying that these experiments with a lot of symbols to try to avoid gender binaries are experiments. And as part of the queer community, I have also talked about the Schwab Act in 2019 because I was in contact with Laura Scaramuncino, who had told me about Luca Foschetto, who was trying to use that in translation. I basically deal with translation. So we were thinking, shall we probably also propose it for that? But also having gone to various meetings of Movimento Nazionale, Laboratorios Mascheramenti, which are queer groups in Bologna, we always back from, I would say 2012, always talked about the creative nature of these experiments, the fact that we're proposing something, but not in a way to systematize language that has to become the norm, but rather that we show what is missing and show what language excludes. And so that's been always as part of our experiment, but this extends not only to the use of these strategies to avoid gender binaries, but also to the use of nouns and other parts of the language, of the grammar, in a creative way to mask heteronormativity in language. So there's a lot of experiments. If you look at, for example, the website of Laboratorio Maschiling, I remember we talked a lot about that during the Campeggio Transfeminista. So there were really, really creative use of language. So I think that's the important also message to pass. And thank you for also showing me like all the detractors of the schwa, because I didn't remember all this production in the last years. But also to answer Alice what I just said, now schwa is also used more and more in translation, and actually with co-translator Feminoska, we just translated the handbook, the Feminist Joy handbook by Sarah Ahmed, and Fandango let us use the schwa, and also in the previous publication. So also bigger publishers now allow translators to use the schwa. I'm not saying all of them, but some of them. So is extended outside FAQ and other publisher. ATS, of course, has always been very open. ATS Alter, the book series Alter, has been very open to the use also.
And also Sette Nove in the context of school books, for example. So yeah, there are many examples right now.
There are a few, but also now Fandango. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I also have to leave you now because I have to go after my daughter. So
I think Vera, because it is 6:30, that it is a wrap. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for following the seminar series for the past month. Again, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Vera. We've learned so much.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I will send you over the slides, okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and hopefully see you soon.